Hello, 1 second.
Hello.
I started the live the live webinar, so people are coming in. Oh God, I'm having video issues.
Oh no.
Of course. Anyway, how are you today?
Okay, how are you?
I am well. Your lighting looks good.
Great. Oh, yeah, it's dim out, but might help a little bit too.
Okay, good. Why? I don't understand what's happening with my. It's always the technology. So we are also streaming live on Facebook. Okay. I don't know why my camera isn't.
Oh, and it looks like screen sharing is disabled.
I know, yeah, it's not letting me.
Inevitable IT problems.
Oh, I know. Yeah, tell me about it. It's always something. Okay. I am Jennifer Krishka, CEO of the Jewish Women's Foundation of the Greater Palm Beaches. Our mission is to advance the status of women and girls locally, nationally, and in Israel. And for the next 3 to 5 years, we are specifically focusing on improving and supporting economic opportunities for women and girls. This is the first webinar that we have had in many, many months. And so we are excited to talk about a really important issue, which I think is divisive for some people. And so we have Jessica Mason with us from the National Partnership for Children and Families. And so Jessica is going to do a really great presentation. And of course, if there are questions, please use the Q&A feature that's probably on the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, and then we will get to those after Jessica goes through some of her presentation. So I think that we are ready to go. Jessica, you should have screen sharing.
Great, thank you. And hi, everybody. Good morning. Nice to virtually meet you all. And I'm really excited to talk about paid family medical leave today. And I will see if I can get my screen going. Is that visible, Jennifer?
Yeah, I can see that pretty well.
Excellent. Yeah, so I'm a senior policy analyst for economic justice at the National Partnership for Women and Families. And I'm very pleased to be chatting with you today about National Paid Family and Medical Leave, which we at the partnership believe is a deeply important policy that could touch every family in the country and make a real difference to people's lives. So I will talk about that today. I should start by saying that the National Partnership is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, which we're very proud of. And the organization certainly predates me, but we are really proud of our legacy, having worked toward many of the great advances in the United States over the past 50 years, advancing women's equality and advancing life for families. And we've got lots more information on our website, which I won't get into, but feel free to visit us and check us out. So today in the United States, we know that women and their families are struggling, and that struggle has economic implications for all of us. And I'm missing one of my first points here. But in the United States, women had been increasing their participation in the economy and the labor force throughout the middle of the 20th century. But that progress really stalled out a couple decades ago in the 1990s, 2000s. And today we lag behind a lot of similar countries. So if the United States had women's labor force participation similar to comparable countries like Canada and the United Kingdom, we would actually have a $650 billion more in GDP and economic activity each year, and nearly 5 million more women would be in the labor force. At the individual level, at the family and household level, that also has an impact. Women are held back in many ways in the workforce and in equal participation in the economy. And the dollar figure we put on that is the women's wage gap, which I'm sure folks are familiar with. But right now, when you're looking at full-time year-round workers, women are paid just 83 cents to every dollar paid to a man. And this is a dollar figure, but it represents a lot of inequity. That means less money in your pocket to pay basic expenses. But that also means over time having less to save for emergencies, healthcare expenses, those kinds of things. And over time, less retirement security for women later in their lives. And the net causes of that are manifold. It's many, many things. But a huge piece of it is the fact that even though we've had a lot of culture change over the past couple of generations, women still continue to do more of the caregiving for families, and that's typically unpaid caregiving work. And it's important, it's affirming, it's something that is deeply meaningful to most people, but at the same time, it conflicts with the way that we've set up our economy. And so that means women tend to be more likely to spend time out of the labor force when they have kids or when they have other family members who need care. It means when push comes to shove, women are more often the ones taking part-time jobs, taking more flexible work that pays worse, that has fewer benefits. And those things add up over time. So at the partnership, we really see this as an issue that requires a number of different solutions that are all interlocking, including protection from discrimination and harassment in the workplace, including affordable quality childcare and elder care, better access to flexible and predictable schedules, fair pay and good wages. Of course, everybody needs good wages. We also have a health justice team at the partnership, and so we think a lot about the intersections of caregiving and our health policy. And then there's a policy I'll talk about today, which really brings together a number of these pieces. Having access to pay when you need time off from work, but particularly for family caregiving and health reasons. So when we're talking about paid family and medical leave, we're talking about paid time off for serious health conditions. So that includes, but is not limited to, pregnancy and childbirth, but also includes things like having surgery or recovering from a major illness or injury, and caring for a family member who has one of those serious health conditions or disability. And right now, just over 1/5 of workers have access to paid family leave through their employer. And so that leaves the vast majority of the workforce without this really important protection. And just 40% have personal medical leave for their own serious health condition through their employer. So that's 6 in 10 workers who, if they needed to get surgery or cancer treatment or recover from a major illness or injury, might not be able to access pay when they take that time off. And our only national law right now that provides any time away from work for workers is the Unpaid Family Medical Leave Act. And that only covers 56% of workers. So that leaves a lot of people who are unable to have access to pay and may also risk losing their job and their health insurance when they need to take time away from work. So because of the ways that our economy is set up kind of unevenly from the start, who has those benefits also kind of falls unevenly. So as we see looking at demographic economic data, the workers who are least likely to both be covered by the job protection of the FMLA and have the money to be able to afford unpaid time off without falling into a deep financial hole, workers of color are less likely to both be protected and be able to afford that unpaid leave. And so we see those kinds of inequities kind of coming across the board. So I wanted to make sure to touch on our particular economic conundrum right now. So I've sort of talked about the general dilemmas that women and their families are facing due to our lack of caregiving policies, and that has these broader economic implications. And then the pandemic came along last year, and I think we're all familiar with the many deep disruptions and hardships and the huge toll that pandemic has taken on all of us in different ways. But one of those ways is that our lack of caregiving policies meant that our economy fell into an even deeper hole than it needed to when things started to shut down last year. There's a sociologist who likes to say the United States doesn't have a safety net, it has women. And that's what we see happening here. So this is a little bit of a complicated chart, but the gist is to show the percent change in the number of people who were employed over this past year and a half. And the solid lines represent women and the dotted lines represent men. So the basic story here is that we see when things began shutting down last year, women lost even more jobs than men and have been much slower to regain that employment over time. And that's been especially hard for Black and Latino women. The couple of reasons for this are, number one, because of the things I was talking about before, we have discrimination, we have women being pushed into those more flexible part-time jobs that often are worse paid. Women were over-concentrated in a lot of the industries that experienced the greatest shutdown. So we're talking about things like waitstaff at restaurants, retail workers, childcare workers. And so the industries that experienced those shutdowns were more likely to be women dominated in a lot of ways. And then of course, the second thing is that women providing the caregiving means when schools shut down, when childcare shut down, someone has to take care of the kids. When family members start falling ill, someone has to be there to care for them, to make sure they're eating, to make sure they're getting their medications. And in both of those situations, it's still more likely to be women than men. And so women sort of face this double bind through the pandemic and still haven't recovered. And I want to emphasize too, for very understandable reasons, issues like childcare and school closures have gotten a huge amount of attention over the past year and a half. But I think we really also cannot underestimate the fact that the pandemic is also a health issue. When people are getting sick, they can't work, obviously, right? And so one of the major drags on our economy right now is that people have been sick. And we have not been able to support enough of them to take time off to care for themselves. There's been some great research that indicates people who were able to fully rest for 2 weeks after coming down with COVID were less likely to develop a chronic condition over time. So when we think about these things like, how work intersects with health, we really need to be thinking really carefully about the cost of not letting people take time off to rest and recover when they need it. And again, just wanted to emphasize that all of this really intersects with, or gender and race are both really intersecting in these economic and health issues. where, as we've talked about, women on the front end are less likely to be paid as well. They're less likely to have resources to fall back on. And the same is true for people of color, and women of color are, of course, at the intersection of both of those things. So when we're talking about people who don't have access to job protection when they need time, people who don't have access to pay when they need time off of work, women of color are sort of being hit from both ends and less likely to have savings to be able to weather that time off unpaid or a job loss. And so what we see at the end of the day is, as of last fall, or as of, last summer, we have in the first place a shocking number of adults who would be unable to pay $400 unexpected expense. But as we can see, those numbers are especially high for Black and Latinx adults. And then one point I'll make here, just in terms of the kinds of policies that we need to have protected time off for all workers, because we know that when you leave things up to a manager's discretion, sometimes certain kinds of discrimination creep in. And so we have some evidence of real racial inequities, as well as gender inequities, in terms of who meaningfully has access to that time off. Okay, so that's sort of all setting up all of the problems. The majority of workers do not have access to paid family and medical leave. That takes a huge toll on our health. That takes a toll on our economy. It takes a toll on our families. It has a huge impact on women over time, as they're often being pushed out of the workforce to do that caregiving that's not supported in the workplace. But this is something we can fix. We have a lot of problems in this country that are very, very complicated, and we don't know how to fix them. Paid leave is not one of those. We actually know how to do it because 10 states have done it. So I've got the list of states there, starting in California in 2004. A number of states have created paid family and medical leave programs. And they've been working well for a number of years. They've not cratered the economy. They've not made all the businesses go out of business. In fact, they've been working really well and have provided us a lot of evidence about the economic and health and gender equity benefits of these programs. So I'll touch on a little bit of the technical details. We can get into more if you have detailed questions. I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A. But the gist of these programs is that the bulk of them are run by the state government. They basically create a fund that pays a wage replacement benefit when a worker has a serious health or caregiving need. So some key features of these programs are that all or nearly all workers are covered, no matter what kind of employer they work for. So, we often have different kinds of workplace rights that are, only for people at larger employers, or they only apply if you work a certain number of hours a week, that kind of thing. These programs cover just about everybody, which means that everybody has access to them, which makes sense, right? Like, you don't sort of need less recovery time from an illness just because you're a part-time worker or something like that. Like, you need the time you need. If you have a baby, you need to be there with the baby, whether or not you work at a really big employer or really small one. So these programs cover just about everybody. They cover what we think of as comprehensive family and medical leave, which means they provide time for new parents to bond with children. They provide time for family caregivers to care for an elder, or disabled, or injured or ill family member, and they provide that medical leave for people's own health conditions when they can't work. The program provides the wage replacement when someone is on leave. So that means it doesn't have to come directly out of the employer's pocket. That's really important for smaller businesses that might not have a lot of cash flow time to time. And so, if you're talking about a little bookstore with 3 or 4 employees, trying to cover 12 weeks of someone's maternity leave out of pocket could be really challenging. So these programs fill in that, that wage replacement, which makes it much more doable for the smaller employers. And then we've seen a number of different innovations in these states over time, improving the percentage of wages that they replace, especially for lower income workers, to make sure that's affordable leave. When we're thinking about which family members you can take leave to care for, we've seen states become more and more inclusive in terms of thinking about who family members are for different kinds of people. And we've also seen some really interesting innovations in support for small employers to kind of help them manage that worker being out. So the key principles we think about then are, for a national paid family and medical leave program, we want to see a program that includes all working people, no matter where they live, who their employer is, or what kind of job they have. Because we know these kinds of health and caregiving issues can happen to anybody, no matter where they live or work. A program needs to be comprehensive and cover that basic range of needs. And I can touch on a little bit more about why we want that comprehensive coverage if folks are curious. But one of the core issues is, number one, it's what people need. And number two, it's really important for gender equity. We know that in some of the research internationally, where there are programs that have rightly really generous maternity leave programs, but if you set up a program as mainly for maternity leave, what we see happen is that it can actually lead to discrimination over time in women in their jobs. You sort of get this idea from employers that like leave, that's for women to go have babies. So when they see a young woman apply for a job, they're thinking in the back of their heads like, she's going to be out for 2 years. And so this comprehensive coverage helps emphasize that caregiving is for everybody. Women, yes, but also men, and also the sort of the full range of family purposes. And so we got this kind of broader sense of who is involved in caregiving, which contributes to gender equity over time. So the third point there, a meaningful duration of time is of course important so that people aren't going back to work too early. And the amount of wages being replaced, needs to be enough for people to be able to live on when they're recovering or when they're doing their caregiving. Sustainable funding, which is important for any kind of a government program, of course, and we can talk about some of the thinking about how to do that in different states and at the national level. And then some security so that folks don't think that their job is going to be at risk if they take the time they need. And these are principles that have been endorsed by more than 75 companies. We have a Business Advancing Paid Leave website I can link to you afterwards, because these are principles that make sense not only for working people, not only for women and families, but also for businesses. And then I'll touch a little bit just on the kinds of research we've seen, especially from those state programs that have been around a number of years. We see that access to paid family and medical leave really helps keep women attached to their jobs after they have a child, and then earn higher wages over time. So having the right amount of time early when you need it actually helps keep job attachment later on. We see that access to paid paternity leave gets men involved in caring for children early in their lives. They get to be more confident caregivers, and that means they're more involved over time, also more involved in domestic work. And in heterosexual couples, that means better kind of more gender egalitarian relationships over time, which also helps women's wages and helps men, meet the caregiving that they increasingly want to be doing. We see that over time, younger generations of men really want to be involved fathers. And so we need to make sure that our policies support them to do that as well. We see that workers who have family caregiving leave are more likely to stay in the labor force. That's especially important these days as our population is aging. We have folks with maybe older spouses and parents they're taking care of. And so that family caregiving leave policy means, if God forbid, someone breaks a hip, you can, take a couple of days or a week or two to be off with them, kind of help them get back up to speed before going back to work without having to leave your job altogether and lose your income, lose your retirement savings, those kinds of things. Paid family and medical leave are shown to help reduce poverty, help reduce food insecurity, especially for lower income families. And we see just a whole host of health improvements, particularly for maternal and child health. Paid leave helps reduce postpartum depression rates. It reduces respiratory illnesses for new children. It reduces preterm births, low birth weight births, all of these things, which really pay dividends over time in, children's health, in parents' peace of mind, and of course to our health costs over time. And then on the business side, I like to emphasize this because often people think that a policy that's going to be really good for working people must somehow be coming on the backs of businesses, but in fact, paid leave is good for both. So what we see is that businesses tend to lose a lot of money when they have worker turnover. It takes a lot of time and money to find a good replacement for someone, to train them, to get them up to speed. And so a policy like paid leave, that means someone can stay attached to their job, take the time they need and then return to their employer, actually ends up saving businesses money. We also know that improving workers' health can save on insurance costs. That's sort of the bottom line approach. We like people to have good health for their own benefit, but it also has this dollar benefit. Paid leave is a great attractor for employees, particularly for younger workers. You know, a lot of us are thinking about the work-life balance, about taking care of our health, and paid leave is a really important piece of that. Paid leave has been shown to improve performance of workers. It improves productivity, it improves morale. And so those are benefits that accrue to the bottom line for businesses. And then a lot of our business supporters also find that it's really a reputation enhancer. You know, it's a signal that a business is committed to gender equity and that it's committed to the well-being of its workers. And so one of the reasons that we really support this kind of public model for paid family and medical leave is that it also puts that all of these benefits in reach for smaller employers who would not necessarily be able to, on their own, afford a really big generous policy. But when we chip in together and create this kind of program, then all employers are able to benefit from it. And just checking the Q&A here. So there's a question about addressing the paid leave plans President Biden has proposed. And yeah, we'll definitely touch on that in just a second here. And then a couple of just data points I wanted to leave you with on that point. We just put out some new research with the Financial Health Network maybe 2 weeks ago. And one of our key findings was actually that workers with paid leave were more likely to recommend their job to a friend. And we also know from the Bipartisan Policy Center, and this was again just about a month ago, more than 1/3 of people who are unemployed right now say they'd be more likely to get back to work if their employer offered paid leave. And I put these out here because there's a lot of conversation in the public right now about how do we get our economy to recover after the pandemic. And I will say, like, you know, first, star one, that the pandemic is not quite over yet. So the first thing is really, you know, making sure we get that virus under control and take care of people's health. But then the second thing is exactly this. We have a lot of people who have not gone back to work or are still working reduced hours because they have caregiving responsibilities. And so a policy like paid leave will help kind of bridge that gap for people. And then we have a few things, just resources. I don't know if folks here are on the employer side, but I wanted to touch on this. We have seen a lot of great advances happening with leading employers in offering paid leave, making it more gender equitable, providing more generous benefits, especially for elder and family care. And you can check out our website at nationalpartnership.org/leadingonleave to learn more about that. And then we get to the current landscape, and it's a busy period of time, busy week, busy month, because as at least a couple of you I'm sure are aware, the Senate and House and Biden administration are deep in the midst of negotiations over a big economic package right now. And a huge piece of that has been a conversation about our lack of caregiving infrastructure in this country, including the needed support for elder care, for home and community-based services for people with disabilities, childcare, which is a desperate need, and then not last and not least, paid family and medical leave. And so the proposals that we've seen come out, number one, in his American Families Plan back from maybe March of this year, earlier this year, President Biden proposed 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave to cover leave for new parents, for family caregivers, for people's own health conditions. And then he also proposed to include paid leave, safe leave for domestic violence survivors, and also 3 days of bereavement leave for folks who need that, which I think would be very, very meaningful to folks. So that's the Biden American Families Plan. A very similar plan was passed through the House Ways and Means Committee last month that would provide 12 weeks of paid family medical leave for most of the same purposes, for new parents, for family caregivers, for medical leave, and for some military caregiving purposes. And so those have been the most detailed plans put out, and are ones that the National Partnership has been really supportive of. But of course, you know, when it comes down to brass tacks, you know, we need to sort of know what all the details are, and you know, we can get, if you're curious, get into a little bit of the back and forth about some of the pressures on Congress. I think there's been a lot of coverage of exactly what the budget number is and sort of what can fit into that total. And so that's kind of what's being negotiated right now, is sort of, what do we need, but also what are, what can you get enough votes for in terms of what the top budget line is going to be for this package. So what we and other paid leave advocates have been pushing for is sort of marshaling all the forces to try to make sure that paid leave makes it into this final package and is a policy that will meet the needs of people. So, we've had this endorsement of a 12-week program from the Biden administration and champions in the House and the Senate. But really critically, this has gotten to this point because we have a broad and diverse movement of grassroots and grass tops advocates in states and cities across the country. We have won support from private sector leaders. In recent weeks, we've seen a great push from Melinda French Gates, for example. And then increasing media coverage of just what this policy would mean for people. And so there are a lot of ways to contribute to that. If you're interested, we can talk more, but I've got a few of them here. Whether you're on the private sector side or just a constituent, the most important thing right now is to let your members of Congress know that this is an issue that you care about and that they need to be pushing for. And then in addition to that, there are ways to push for continued change in the private sector at the local and state level. And then also just to be sharing information with people around you about paid family and medical leave and the difference that it could make. And that could be as much as, writing an op-ed to your local paper or just talking with people around you and raising awareness about this issue and the fact that it's something that we are on the verge of moving on and that we really could have a paid family medical leave program in the United States this year. So I will leave it at that so we can jump over to Q&A. And if you wanted me to go back over anything I mentioned, feel free to ask. If I jogged ideas about other issues you want to ask about, please feel free.
So Jessica, I see we received another question about the way, I guess, that states fund these programs. Can you maybe expound upon that a little bit?
Yes, hold on. I touched the button to try to stop screen sharing and there it goes. Okay, hi. Yeah. So for the most part, states fund their paid family and medical leave programs through what's called a social insurance model, a little bit like Social Security, where they basically have a small tax on payroll that goes into that common fund that then pays out. So basically you have a combination of workers and employers who are covered by the programs, paying a very small amount over time. And then when someone takes leave, they get the wage replacement back out of that program. And when I say small, we're talking about, in most states, something like 0.5% up to 1%. So it amounts to a couple dollars a week.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask to drill down on that a little bit. So when a state has a law that requires, I guess, businesses to have a paid leave program, that applies to any business, corporation. It applies to like municipal employees, government workers.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in the first place, in the majority of cases, and there's sort of an asterisk there, New York is a bit of an odd duck. But in the majority of cases, these states don't precisely have a requirement on employers to provide paid leave. But what they have is a state program that provides the paid leave, and employers participate in it by providing the time off and also paying a small tax into that fund. And so it's a little bit of a compromise option because, as I mentioned, particularly for smaller employers, if the state simply came in and said, everyone has to provide 12 weeks of paid leave, some of those employers would say, like, that's just not something that we can afford to do out of pocket. And so what's happened is that they set up these paid family medical leave funds that then sort of provide the bulk of the issue of being the money directly to the worker when they take leave. And then the employer's contribution is essentially that small tax over time and providing just the time off. And so what we actually see happening is that for some employers, when someone goes on leave, if it's at that period of time, in a certain sense, kind of a cost savings, because for that, 6 weeks, for that 12 weeks, whatever the leave time is, the employer is no longer paying somebody's salary. And so that frees up their budget to, pay a little bit of overtime, to hire a temp if they need one, although we find that that's actually kind of rare. And more often what they're doing is, sharing out the work, putting things on hold for a couple of weeks till someone gets back, and that kind of thing. So that's sort of generally the function of how the program works. Now, in terms of the nuances of exactly which employers are covered, private sector employers are covered in these programs. On the public sector side, it varies a little bit from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, just as a matter of kind of state law, whether the state government has authority over municipalities and that kind of thing. We have also seen, because municipalities are not always covered by these programs, in some states, they are then providing it on their own, and we have seen a significant expansion in local government employees having access to paid family leave. Florida, I think, has been actually one of the states on the forefront in terms of jumping ahead with the municipal government leave, being a leading employer in that way in states without a state program.
So essentially, these businesses that are in the states that have these policies are opt-in, I guess, within their company to offer paid leave. Am I understanding that right?
The companies, some of them do offer additional benefits above and beyond that public program. So they might top off the benefit, but it's essentially a state program. And so sort of, to the worker, what'll happen is when they have that need for leave, if they have a surgery coming up, or if they're expecting a child, what they do is, as they are aware, to the as best as it's practicable, they'll work with their manager if they can ahead of time to sort of know when the leave is going to be. But then when the time comes to take off, they essentially fill out some paperwork with the state, and then receive a payment directly from the state government.
Okay, that makes more sense to me now. I'm just trying to get the mechanics down.
Yeah, and it does get a little bit, and this is getting into the weeds, but it sounds like you want to get the weeds. So the asterisk exception I gave was New York State, where they do run it a little bit differently, and in their case, it is a little bit more like a mandate. And so what they have is a system where employers are required to either directly provide the leave or get insurance coverage for it. And most of the employers do the insurance option. And so they have actually like a statewide market for different insurers who will provide, again, essentially this kind of benefit. And so the requirement to sort of that you have some kind of coverage, it's a little bit like health insurance that way, but they have the option to sort of pick and choose where they want to get that provided from. And likewise, this is a little bit like disability insurance where or it's sort of an expansion of the disability insurance market, where then again, when that employee goes out on leave, they might tell their manager that they're on leave, but then file the paperwork with the insurance company to get that reimbursement.
I see. Okay, so we had another question came in. So the question is, are you saying, excuse me, are you saying that the states administer the federal funds themselves, and then who decides the program and the rules that they administer?
Yeah. So right now we don't have a federal program. So these are states administering their own funds. And so that they set their own rules within the states. And so, in each state, it's, something that the legislature typically has written up and developed the specific rules. And then, they have their own regulations about how to apply all of those kind of fine details of the government program. Now, what's envisioned for a federal program, of course, is, we would like to set up a similar type of thing federally, but of course, it would need to kind of work hand in hand with the state programs that have been around for so long. In the federal program, so can I ask for clarification? Is this a question about how the federal program would interact with the state programs, or sort of what the federal program would look like compared to these state ones?
I think the question, this I understand it right, is so the federal proposal that the current administration is looking at right now. So let's say that there was some kind of policy enacted on the federal level. I guess, how does that get implemented? So I assume it's Congress, I guess, that's setting the parameters. Okay, so for states that have an existing policy, if there were to be a federal policy that were passed, do the states then all have to comply with the federal policy, or are they able to maintain their own policy?
Yeah, these are all really great questions, getting right into the meat of the policy making. So what's envisioned for a federal program is, to the extent that states want to work with it, the federal program would essentially coordinate with those state benefits. And so I can speak to the specifics of the language that's been passed through that House committee I mentioned. What basically happens there is that the federal program would cover, a certain amount of leave, in this case, 12 weeks for these purposes, at a certain benefit rate, et cetera. And the state programs would have the option of matching up to that and getting reimbursement from the federal government for that part of the program. And so essentially, for people working in California, they would receive that state coverage and still be working with the state sort of state agencies that have put all this investment into their own systems, and then the state agency would be reimbursed for that portion of it by the federal government. So people wouldn't be sort of double covered, and the state would be getting its sort of fair share of the federal funding, but would still have the option of administering it themselves for their own people.
Okay. And another question came in. So are states allowed to refuse to participate if, the proposal were to go through on the federal level?
Yeah, this is a good question. So and this is sort of gets to this question of sort of federal versus state program management. So what's envisioned for the federal program is for the bulk of the program to be a federal program. So generally speaking, people in most of the country would simply be covered by that national program. And so what's been set out.
If you're in a state that doesn't have, a state program, and then the federal policy passes, that means, like, as an employee, if you wanted to take paid leave, you would then apply still through your state, or then you would have to apply directly through, I guess, the federal government?
Yeah, it would be just through the federal government. And so the legislation on the table would basically set up a new office. And these are some of the details being hashed out, is whether that office would be in the Social Security Administration or some other agency. But there would be a new office set up. They would set up a website, have some forms you could fill out, and you would just go straight there and apply. And if you met the eligibility requirements and sort of had the right, appropriate kind of need, you would just be getting it straight from the federal government, and your state wouldn't be able to get in your way, I guess.
Right.
But in some states that already have programs, they would have the option of coordinating with the federal government. So that, for example, as I mentioned, people in those states with programs are already kind of paying taxes into it and all of that. So what we wouldn't want to end up with is a situation where there were like two parallel systems that weren't talking to each other. So there's going to be coordination with the states that already exist. But for states without any current program on their own, those people would just simply be covered by the national program.
Okay. Would you say that that's analogous to how the Affordable Care Act works? Or you can have insurance like an employer, but then you can also go to the marketplace?
That's so I as someone who's been a beneficiary at different times from that model of the Affordable Care Act, I don't want to say anything bad about it. But I think we're hoping for something that is not quite as complicated for the average person. So I will say that the benefit of this core federal program is that instead of sending people out where you would have to go out every year and get insurance coverage on your own and sort of figure that whole thing out, it would be much more like Social Security, where there's just one system, and when you have this need, you just go straight to this office and they will write you a check, basically, for your wage replacement. So individual people would not need to be going out and like getting insurance coverage or anything like that for this kind of system.
Okay. So I want to ask a question. I know another question popped up, but I do want to ask a question not about necessarily like these very specifics, but I want to focus a little bit on something that you touched upon earlier in your presentation, which is the way that not having paid leave impacts women financially in a long-term kind of way, right? So like what it means for women who then have to just come out of the workforce because they don't have the paid leave option.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the biggest drivers of the wage gap, that 83 cents on the dollar that I mentioned, is women spending time out of the workforce. And that's most often after they have children, but can also come after major other health or family caregiving issues. Women have a little bit of a higher rate of long-term disabilities and chronic illnesses, for example, that can be really difficult to balance with a job if you don't have leave or other supportive policies. And we also see, men do this also, but women at a slightly higher rate of retiring early to take care of a spouse or other family member. And those are all things that definitely take a toll on income and savings over time. So zooming back to kind of that early stage of life, what we see, I mentioned the wage gap is 83 cents to the dollar year by year. But if you look over a 10-year period and sort of include the time that women spend out of the workforce, the wage gap is something more like 50 cents on the dollar. It's quite devastating. And so that does leave women in this much more precarious economic position, and of course takes a toll on the rest of their household as well.
Right. And that's for white women, right? We're talking about that wage. We're not talking about
women overall. Yeah, and it gets much worse if you disaggregate it and start looking at particular groups of women of color.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, something else I want to touch upon too. So when we're talking about paid leave, I think a lot of people tend to focus exclusively on like the birth of a child, let's say, or even, the adoption of a child. But I think it's really important to emphasize that it would also include, care of a loved one. And certainly, we've seen a lot of our members whose parents, have started to decline, who've really had to, step up to take care of them, or, to be able to assist them with their health issues, et cetera. So can you just talk maybe a little bit more about that aspect of things?
Yeah. As I mentioned, we know this is always an important need with every generation, and a growing need across the country because of the aging of our population overall. Paid leave is really critical for those family caregivers, and makes a difference. So having that family caregiver around, I'm sure folks on this call know, being there in those doctor's appointments, being able to, be a second voice, listen to some of those more complex instructions, and then we see at the end of the day, the family caregiver is giving really increasingly complex amounts of care at home, from administering medications to even helping with injections and those kinds of things. And that requires time and dedication and presence. And so having that family caregiver around is really, really important. I'll say one study that I find very, very important about the California paid leave is that after paid leave was implemented in California, we actually saw a decline in nursing home utilization among adults above 65. And I think that's really striking because, there certainly are cases when an older adult really needs that specialized care. But also, I know in my own family, folks who would much rather stay at home as long as they can, and often can stay home longer if they have that family caregiving support.
Right. And of course, like most of these issues, women are disproportionately affected by this aspect too, right? Because generally speaking, it's the daughter or a woman in the family who ends up being the person to step in as the caregiver.
Exactly. And that's, hours at the, not just being with that older adult, but, going back and forth to medical appointments and being there at the drop of a hat if some emergency comes up. And those things can really take a toll if your employer is not set up to be supportive.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I like to kind of drill down on those issues because I think that sometimes this feels very abstract to a lot of people, when you're talking about paid leave and you're talking about policy, that I think that it definitely can feel like a bit like nebulous, right? And it's difficult to think about it in a tangible way, but this issue impacts basically everybody. And women, families, etc. And so, I mean, I feel at least that this is really, really important for us to address because the impact of having paid leave policies are just myriad. So I appreciate all the details, that we're going into, and I get a lot of our participants are interested in these specifics. So we had 2 more questions that popped up.
Yeah, I love all the wonky questions, but yeah, definitely important to stay grounded in that. Like at the end of the day, what we're talking about is people having the peace of mind of being able to know that they can be there for their families and that they can take care of their health without having to stress about whether they can pay the bills. And we know that when we solve for those 2 problems, it really makes a huge difference to people. So I will touch on these other 2 technical questions. This question of sort of how would a state or national program, so the hypothetical national program that we're working towards, relate to the paid leave benefits that some employers already provide? So there are sort of 2 things. One thing is that and this is again in reference to the specific bill that's been through the House, which I can sort of talk about because it has so much specific language already. The concept there is that for employers who are providing a benefit that meets the full standard of the federal benefit, the employee or the employer would have the option of just providing that direct benefit and getting a partial reimbursement from the government. And an employee who was covered by that would not also get the federal benefit for that same time. So you sort of have like this kind of one area where if the employer were providing this precise benefit and had sort of filled out their paperwork the right way, that employee would not be double covered in a sense. But that said, employers would then still be free for the general program. The government program would provide this sort of baseline, and then an employer would always be free to top it up or add on extra time if they wanted to. So there still would be that option for employers to go above and beyond what the baseline was. Then the payroll tax. So in the states, the payroll tax is basically, it's a little bit, there are other programs like workers' comp that work like this in the states where basically each year they have an insurance commissioner, some official whose job it is to take a look at the money that's in the trust fund and sort of do a projection of need. And they will tweak that payroll tax just to make sure that there's enough money in the fund from year to year. And what we've seen over time is that those rates might go up a tick, might go down a tick, but they stay fairly steady over time. And so it's based on that experience that the cost estimates of a federal paid leave program were worked out. And this 0.5%. So there was a bill called the Family Act that we've advocated for a long time that was set up in this way to have a payroll tax federally, like nationwide, to create this kind of fund that would have been about that. And that estimate was just based on the data from the states about utilization. I should note, and this is again in the weeds but important, because President Biden made a campaign promise not to raise taxes on people under a certain income. He has not been supportive of having a payroll tax to fund the national program. And so instead, what's under consideration is for the national program to be funded by some to be determined combination of tax increases on wealthy corporations, on very high wealth individuals, something in that vein, but is no longer tied one-to-one to a payroll tax.
Yeah, we have a few minutes left. There's another question that came through. So I have another question for you. This is a very long question that came through. So obviously, this is a complex issue. I think in terms of understanding the benefits, but also the implementation, right? Because obviously we can see everyone is really interested in like the specifics of how paid leave gets implemented. So my question for you, Jessica, for someone who is like working in this space all the time and who works for an organization that is trying to use data and research to make actual changes. How do you think that the average person can get involved in this, given how difficult it can be to understand? And do you think that the complexities of the issue and implementation are a barrier, I guess, to successful advocacy around the topic?
So I hope the complexity of topic isn't a barrier. I would say, when it comes to just being an advocate on an issue that you care about, you can get as far into the weeds as you want, but also the most critical thing for enacting these kinds of policies is just for members of Congress to hear that their constituents care about this issue and want them to do something about it. And, that can be really up to your comfort level and your style, whether that means coming to them with a personal story or coming to them with a sheaf of complicated policy documents. And I would say often the personal story and the message from the heart is more important. They'll be getting the policy details. They have staff in their offices. They have folks like us who will come in with, I read this line in the bill and I don't think it means what you think it means. But they really, to really change their mind or to make sure they vote on an issue, what matters most is hearing that the people that they represent will be affected by it. And that's not something that takes a lot of policy details. That's something that takes personal experience and just an honest message from your own experience.
So I'm thinking of specifically, so Marco Rubio, I'm sure he tried to, put forth this paid leave plan where the paid leave would be coming out of your like Social Security. So essentially, I think this is how it worked, right? That you'd end up basically taking out your Social Security early in order to pay like the paid leave that you were taking. Is that right?
Yeah, I definitely remember this one. I spent a lot of time looking at that bill.
Well, there are certainly better types of implementation, right, than others, which I guess that's also kind of what I'm asking about in terms of like what we want people to like rally behind.
I think, to the message that to me, or has, I guess, as far as that goes, the message that I would emphasize is that paid leave is worth making a new investment in. This is something that it is worth us as a country coming together to do because it's what people need. And it's not going to leave families any better off if you're cutting one thing they need to pay for a different thing they need. You can't stop paying your electricity bill so you can buy groceries, right? That doesn't leave you better off in the end of the day. You need money for both. And so paid family and medical leave is something that is worth making that investment in. And this attitude that we have to pick and choose between the things that regular families need is I think just race to the bottom.
Right, which they're already doing. So it would just, I just think it would make everything better for us to have these policies. So, all right, so the last question before we wrap up. Okay, so Jessica, from your perspective, is it better for employees if there is a government plan or if individual employers create their own paid leave policies? I'm going to start there. This is like a really long question.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. So, I'm certainly always supportive of employers, when they want to doing good things for their employees. But at the end of the day, an employer voluntarily doing something is not a right that their workers have, right? That's the employer voluntarily doing something that they could revoke the next day. And that also is a real disservice to the many workers who lose their jobs or who move from employer to employer over time. And so, for a policy like this, we know that every single person at some point in their working life is going to need some time away from work for at least one of these serious issues, whether it's a new child or an illness or, a spouse who gets sick. Everyone's going to be affected by that at some point. And so we need a policy that covers everybody, so that's just baseline support that people ought to have access to. And we know that there are all these benefits from doing so. And so that is the kind of program that the government is really in the best position to create, because it's something that needs to be secure for everybody kind of through time and across their working lives. And so when we're talking about something like that, that needs to be able to cover you no matter where you are, no matter which state you live in, no matter what happens to your employer, government is the backstop that is there to be able to provide that kind of ongoing, permanent support. Now, I did see the bit of the question asking sort of about politics. Like it's true that the government can, one party can pass something and another party can come along and try to take it away. And I think there's, that's the reality of living in a democracy for better or for worse. Right. But the difference between that and an employer changing a policy is that we do still have a democratic government. And so, elections do happen and a party has to go through a process to overturn a law. And that, gives us all time to see that it's happening and to push back if we see the need to. And we saw that happen with the Affordable Care Act, of course, a couple of years ago, where many in the Republican Party had run on trying to overturn it, and they really did try, but the outcry was so strong that they were not able to. And so I think when a program is meaningful to a lot of people, the fact that people have it and can fight for it and can defend it is the thing that protects it over time.
Right. I agree. And we see that with lots of other issues, right? Where once you already have a right, I guess, as you see it, or you have, this option, it's much more difficult to take it away, once people have already experienced it. So we are just after 11. So to respect Jessica's time and all of our attendees, we are going to go ahead and wrap up. Jessica, it was so nice to see you. I don't know what's happening with my camera, but hopefully I will see you in the future. We really, really appreciate you facilitating this discussion. If people have additional questions, what would you recommend?
You're always free to email me, jmason@nationalpartnership.org, whether you have questions about paid leave, want some follow-up resources, or want to talk about any of the other issues we work on. Yeah, and thank you so much for your awesome questions.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you soon at another upcoming event. We have lots of fun things planned, so check out our calendar at jwfpalmbeach.org. I want to thank Eileen Berman and Jay Bauer for supporting our educational programs. So I'm wishing everybody be well, stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you, everybody.